Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just another minute. We're waiting for a few more people to log on. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our sixth webinar for our Colorado Safe Routes to School series. Today, we're going to be talking all about school sighting, how to support walking, biking, and active kids. My name is Corey Johnson. I'm the Program Support Manager here at Safe Routes Partnership, and I'm joined by my colleague, Michelle Lieberman, who is the Consulting and Program Support Director. So for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, just a bit about Safe Routes Partnership and what we do. Our mission is to advance safe walking and rolling to and from schools in everyday life, improving the health and well-being of people of all races, income levels, and abilities, and building healthy, thriving communities for everyone. As I mentioned, my name is Corey, and Michelle will also be joining me. We will be your facilitators for today, and we're looking forward to having a nice conversation all about school sighting. A few go-to-webinar housekeeping issues in case you might be new to this platform. To the left is the go-to-webinar viewer through which you'll see the presentation. To the right is the go-to-webinar control panel where you can raise your hand, ask questions, and select the audio mode that you'll use. You can either join through computer audio or by phone. Also, if you have any sound issues, sometimes computer audio isn't working or phone audio isn't working. So just try and figure out which one will work best for you. Yeah, you should be able to access the audio through one of those options. And we also encourage you to ask questions in the chat box. So if you have questions or comments for us today, we will have some time at the end for Q&A. So we'd like for this to be, like a discussion. We want to make sure we can answer all the questions that you might have. So please feel free to use the chat box throughout the course of our presentation today. So a quick review of our agenda. We're talking all about school sighting. So we're going to start out by talking about why school sighting matters, what the benefits are, who are the main players and stakeholders in school sighting, and then we'll move into talking about different policies. What does school sighting look like on a school district level, a local government level, and then a state level, where we'll really talk about what this looks like in Colorado. And we'll round out our time today with a Q&A portion. So just a quick definition of what school sighting actually is. So school sighting is shorthand for the bundle of decisions that affect where schools end up located. I know that sometimes I drive by schools and I'm like, wow, why is there this random school in the middle of nowhere? Who made that choice? Or, oh, why is this school in this specific neighborhood? So school sighting decisions include considerations about where to build new schools, where existing schools will be closed, whether to renovate a school or start over, as well as other decisions about the design and orientation of a school on a specific site. And why does school sighting matter? So school sighting matters for a lot of reasons. There are health benefits, environmental benefits, lots of benefits for the community, government efficiency, and also having fewer travel expenses for families and more involvement. So smart school sighting means that communities are able to take advantage of these benefits. So for students to be able to walk or bike to school or to use student recreational facilities outside of school hours, it is essential that schools be located relatively near to where students live. School siting also matters because schools that are located near where students are living can reduce air pollution in the community, and may also reduce exposure to students, exposure of students in idling vehicles, which can, definitely affect asthma and other lung disease outcomes. School siting also means that students waste less time sitting on school buses and private vehicles, and lesser distances also support higher levels of family involvement in school activities, kind of thinking about a school as more of a community hub where there are sports games, sometimes there are religious services, voting places, community meetings. There's a lot that happens in a school. And so where a school is located can impact the community's ability to access a school as a resource. School siting should also ensure that air quality hazards and other environmental dangers are minimized for students. So this means avoiding sites that pose dangers to students, such as those that are near freeways, near industries that see heavy traffic, or in locations that might require that students face dangerous street crossings, or sites that might be near toxic contaminants. And school siting can also lead to more government efficiency by spending less money on busing, and also benefits families who can spend less money on their travel expenses if a student can walk or bike or roll to school. So that's a little bit about why school siting matters and why it's important. And we also know that there are a lot of barriers to school siting. So everything from state policies and educational trends, there are city policies and development trends. There are also a lot of schools that might close due to economic troubles. And so, we've found that the trend has been that school sizes have gotten larger and then pushed out of the center of neighborhoods. I know that I grew up in a suburb in Maryland, and the school that I went to was located right in our neighborhood. So, everybody could walk to school. And I've noticed just in my own community, with the new schools that are coming up, they're not located in neighborhoods anymore. A lot of them are located, some kind of seem like far away from everything, or are kind of off of a freeway or a highway that make them a bit harder to get to. Also, schools are growing in size. So in 1950, the average elementary school size was 110 students, and now it's over 500. So you see a lot of these mega schools that are being built that can hold up to 1,000 or more students on an elementary school campus, which can seem like a lot, especially for an elementary school. And in some states, state policies have driven districts to build larger schools. So these schools need more land and can't be accommodated in neighborhood centers anymore. So that's why you might see some of these sprawling campuses that are located outside of a core neighborhood. We also have sprawling developments that are coming up now, as opposed to building interconnected neighborhoods. So again, kind of creating a situation where, it might not be easy for students to walk or bike to school because the development is sprawling, as opposed to being centered in a walkable and bikeable neighborhood. And there are also a lot of school closures due to the cost of keeping multiple facilities open and having to consolidate student populations into larger campuses. So just thinking about all the money that goes into, running a school, I guess a counter to that would be closing multiple facilities and just having more students in one location to cut down on costs. So the result of this is that fewer and fewer kids live near their school. In 1969, about 45% of children were living within a mile of their school, and now that's down to 24%. And 61% of parents say that distance is the biggest barrier to walking to school. I'll also point out that there are a lot of, with school choice being more of a thing now, there are some students who, might be going to schools outside of their neighborhood because they're going to a charter school, for example. So that has also affected some of the school siting trends. We've also found that the average high schooler lives more than 6 miles from their school. So again, that can be a kind of long way to walk or bike for students. And we know that poor school siting means less ability to walk, less opportunities for physical activity, poorer health, and less of the other benefits of smart school siting. So now I'm going to talk about, who makes these decisions, who are the main players. So we have the school districts, the local governments, so, planning, Parks Department, Public Works. There are also the state laws, so the state departments of education, transportation, health, and the federal government playing a more limited role. So school districts, they are the ones who decide where schools are located and how campuses are designed. And then they also can determine when schools close, when there are school closures. The local governments, they're more in charge of the vicinity of the school, the routes, and the co-location of facilities, and new housing. And then on the state level, state laws set up the roles of the school district. So most states grant a lot of control to local school districts. Sometimes the Department of Education has funding requirements or guidelines or restrictions around school siting. And then finally, on the federal level, the federal government actually has more of a limited role in school siting. The EPA has provided some voluntary guidance and encouraged smart school siting practices, but again, the role is pretty limited on the federal level. So today we're going to be focusing mainly on school districts, on local governments, and we'll also touch on some policies directly affecting Colorado. So a number of experts agree on a few key principles around smart school siting. And these are things that school districts, local governments, and states can adopt. So specific policies that can be adopted that follow these 10 elements of smart school siting that'll really allow for more people to access the benefits of school siting. And so these 10 principles are collaborative planning, so having that collaboration between the district and the municipality, a long-term data-driven planning, accounting for all costs. So that means ongoing student transportation, the cost of getting utilities to the site, not just the land and the building construction, but how much will it cost to actually keep this facility up and running. Also co-location and shared use, so encouraging district and local governments to coordinate and have efficiencies by co-location, by collating schools with parks and other community facilities that can be shared between the school population and the neighborhood residents. So sometimes you might see a school next to a community center or a pool or a park or a recreation center. Another key element to consider. Also, there's a preference for renovation. I know I live in Washington, D.C., and I know there are some principals who've been begging for their schools to be renovated because they have like these old historic schools, which are beautiful, but renovation is something that's on a lot of people's minds just for safety and accessibility. Also creating diverse walkable schools through school siting and assignment policies. So avoiding creating segregated schools and paying attention to land use patterns and zoning, as well as school attendance boundaries and also housing policies. Next is equity in school facilities, health impacts, incorporating a robust safe routes to school program in school siting, and then finally having safe infrastructure for walking, rolling, and public transportation. So those are the main elements of a smart school siting plan. And as I mentioned before, there are 3 ways to ensure smart school siting, and we talked about the district level, local government level, and the state level. So on the school district level, adopting smart school siting policies that address school location and site design. That's something that can be done at the local school district level. On the government level, it's really about establishing strong systems of ongoing communication and collaboration with school districts. So, keeping in touch with those key stakeholders and involving lots of people in the process, whether it's, school districts, even if they're parent groups or PTAs or student groups who want to get involved, that collaboration piece is key. And then on the state level, we start thinking about setting up permanent policy structures that support safe routes to school and smart school siting. So, those might be like more formal policies or laws that can ensure that smart school siting is something that is a priority and that is really benefiting the community. And so I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and she's going to talk a bit more in detail about each one of these roles in school siting and how and what the best practices are for each group. So Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Corey. Give us a second to switch presenters. Oop, okay. Corey, I think I'm having problems with my screen sharing.
I can share it from mine. Okay, does that work?
Yep, if you could pull up the PowerPoint.
Okay, can you see my screen?
I can see your screen, but not the PowerPoint.
Okay,
There we go. Okay,
got it?
thanks.
Okay.
All right. So like Corey mentioned, you want to start it again, and then I can take control.
Okay.
All right, so as Corey mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit more in more detail about the role and best practices for each group: school districts, local governments, and states. I'm going to start with school districts. When we started looking at school district policies in Colorado, we looked at a number of districts in the state and looked at the adopted policies so far. And it looks like that many districts are already using a template and model policies to address school siting. A number of the districts had the same sort of numbering for their policies and verbiage included in their school siting policies. Overall, we found that there was really limited inclusion of SMART school siting principles, the number of things that Corey talked about. There was limited inclusion of, now the slides are just jumping around. Limited inclusion of prioritization for walking and biking and active travel to school. Really limited mention of supporting schools in dense residential areas or co-location, or balancing walkability and integration into neighborhoods. So all those things that Corey mentioned as in terms of best practices are really opportunities that we see in Colorado for local school districts to include in their policies around school siting. Corey, maybe I'll have you control the slides.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, next slide.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the best practices for school districts. First of all, there's really an opportunity to incorporate strong language supporting safe routes to school into wellness policies. Most districts already have a wellness policy in place. And so there's an opportunity to include specific language around safe routes to school into those wellness policies. School districts also have the ability to adopt strong, supportive, safe routes to school policies, standalone policies. And these first two best practices don't necessarily directly talk to school siting, but they do provide an opportunity to get to our end goal of making walking and biking and active travel, really safe and regular modes of travel for kids. Another best practice for school districts is to develop a statement or of goals or principles, overarching principles for school siting, as well as more detailed considerations that really emphasize proximity, ability to walk and bike, and equitable access to school facilities. And then, as Corey mentioned, having a commitment to ongoing long and short-term data-driven facilities planning. So I'm going to go into greater detail with some of the specifics of these. Next slide. Another best practice is to implement a detailed process involving input and engagement from local communities, the local jurisdiction, other stakeholders, so having that coordinated and collaborative effort, providing design commitments regarding access for walking and biking, bicycle storage, and separation of modes, and then including considerations regarding school assignment and zones that balance walkability and diversity of student body. Next slide. So to take a look at this and make it sort of easy for everyone, we looked at the model policies that were developed by ChangeLab Solutions that really align with those best practices and key principles for school siting. In the email that'll go out after this webinar and on the Colorado Safe Routes to School website, there's an informational brief on school siting. And we linked to a document that has model policies that draw from these policies from ChangeLab Solutions and tailor them for Colorado to match the numbering that's currently being used by a lot of the school districts. So these model policies address, they have an overall overview school siting policy. They also address that long-term coordinated planning, procedures for school site planning, considerations for school siting determinations, site design, and then general guidelines for attendance zones and assignment policies. I'm going to go into a couple of these in more depth so you can see what's included in them. The first one is the school siting policy overview. And this really provides a kind of 10,000-foot view overview of school siting, lays out some general principles, but it's not necessarily really helpful in providing specifics. So the rest of the school siting model policies help identify specific tactics and processes that districts can use and translate into how districts work. So I'm going to go through some of the highlights of what's included in the policies and what best practices look like when put in the policy. So that first one, long-term coordinated planning. We really want school districts to have a long-term view of their facilities and have planning based on data. So looking at enrollment numbers and projections and making really calculated decisions. We also really encourage coordinated efforts with local planning departments. And this really provides the opportunity to think about joint use and co-location possibilities and ways for there to be efficiency. Included in this policy area is also having a mothballing plan for excess facilities. So a plan for facility closures, as well as what happens with those facilities. And then, of course, encouraging work with local jurisdictions so that the local jurisdictions are also taking steps to improve, the residential integration and walkability in the neighborhood and routes leading up to the schools. Next slide. So the next set of policy or policy area within the model policies is criteria for siting decisions. So some of the key criteria that should be included for school siting includes having the school sites be walkable, that a significant percentage of the student population lives nearby, that there's safe routes, obviously, safe places for students to walk and bike leading up to the schools, that support diversity, that are near community resources, and that don't have adjacencies to toxic facilities or contaminants. The next policy area addressed by the model policies is related to site design and access, and these are kind of the specifics that go into the school, layout and amenities provided on them. So, first one is bike parking, ensuring that there is enough bike parking, bike racks, and a place for kids to be able to park their bikes once they get to school. And then having safe access by bike, on foot, by school bus or public transit, and also separating these modes from cars. So next I'm going to talk about local governments and their role in best practices. So some of the best practices for local governments, if you want to skip to the next slide, are zoning and incentivizing dense housing development around existing developed areas rather than sprawling residential development. So this makes it easier for there to be schools within a neighborhood and for the areas to be built up so that way there is the ability for students to attend a school that's close to their home and be able to walk and bike to them. Another best practice for local governments is, again, having these coordinated efforts to co-locate parks, libraries, and other civic areas with existing schools as well as planned schools, so more integration into the neighborhood. Developing and regularly updating an active transportation plan or a bicycle plan or a pedestrian plan, or if the city has a standalone safe routes to school plan, to really address any barriers and make improvements to walking and biking routes to school. Another best practice for local governments can be adopting a safe routes to school resolution. So similar to school districts can adopt a standalone safe routes to school policy, local governments can do this as well and really create this commitment to safe routes to school and coordinating with the schools. Along those lines, a local government can also adopt a complete streets policy that addresses the routes to schools for all users, not just drivers. And then finally, we're going to emphasize this again and again. A really strong best practice is establishing partnerships and systems for ongoing communication and collaboration with local school districts. So since we talked about why collaboration matters so much, I'm just going to reiterate some of the reasons why it's really a best practice to have school districts collaborate with local governments. So why does collaboration matter? Well, first of all, there's a lot of benefits from joint action. This means that the city and the school district are working towards the same goals and having coordinated efforts. And providing a place that's walkable and bikeable for students getting to school really requires the decisions by both parties, the school district and the local government, because they control different aspects of it. So, having a school located near a residential area, well, school siting is controlled by the district, where residential areas are, controlled by the city or county, who's, responsible for the zoning. Providing those safe, well-maintained streets and a walkable network, it's really up to the city and county, who's probably in charge of that network of streets and routes to school. Access to the school site, it's part of school design, often controlled by the school district. And then there's ability to partnership for safe routes to school funds, as well as other funding to support efforts by both parties in order to make walking and biking and access to school better. Next slide. So one example of how this has been done comes from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area in North Carolina. And they actually had a task force where they had 5 jurisdictions that adopted resolutions supporting coordination. So this included the school district, the city, the county, the library, and the community college district. And these resolutions that each of these 5 entities adopted stated that they would have joint facility planning and joint use of facilities to save money. They stated that they would coordinate capital decisions, for example, school placement. And then each agency committed to developing a long-range facility master plan that was coordinated with one another. So staff from about 24 departments from all these agencies met monthly, and they really focused in on addressing joint use and school siting issues. So one example of what they actually did is they developed kind of a multi-part test to help them assess which joint use opportunity or shared use opportunity they would move forward on and promote. They had about a dozen or more separate examples of really successful collaborative projects together, both in joint use and school siting. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly touch on state policy and the role of states and best practices. As Corey mentioned before, really, states can provide some guidance on school siting, but a lot of the work is done at the individual school level. So one of the best practices for states is to set up a permanent state policy structure that provides that guidance on school siting, can leave decisions up to individual districts, but really support good decision making by providing, guidance and support. We also want to see that states are avoiding negative state requirements, guidelines, or incentives for school siting. One key one here is some states impose a minimum acreage requirement that create these excessively large school sites that get pushed out to the outskirts of town, outsides of neighborhoods. So we don't want to see a state put in a minimum acreage requirement. And we also don't want to see a state have a funding rule that gives a preference for new construction over renovation. Some other best practices for states include providing really positive requirements or guidelines or incentives for creating walkable and bikeable school communities. Next slide. So first is a state can provide this guidance to support proximity of school sites to student residential origins. A state can provide guidance that supports co-location of school sites with parks, libraries, and other community spaces. States can support school sites that are well integrated into existing and planned walking and biking networks. States can limit financial support for excessively large or sprawling sites. So not only not requiring a minimum number of acres, but also preventing a large school site from being developed or these sprawling sites by limiting the state support for those, financial support. States can really encourage considering dangers to students, such as exposure to contaminants, traffic hazards, and air pollution. And then support collaborative planning, again, between all the different agencies and partners. Next slide. So we looked at the state policy in Colorado, and two great things here. First, the state does have a state statute on safe routes to school, so it's setting out that commitment already up at the front. And there's also no minimum acreage guideline and no negative policies around school funding or reimbursement that prioritize new construction over renovation. Next slide. On the flip side, there isn't a lot of guidance around all of the things that we see as positive things for states to support school districts and local governments in doing. So there is an opportunity to include more mandatory or voluntary guidelines that could include, funding incentives or just kind of, guidelines and support for all these things. So support for proximity of school sites to, where they live. Support for co-location of facilities, support for school sites that are integrated into existing walking and biking networks, support for consideration of dangers to students in school siting decisions, and then support or guidance on strengthening collaborative planning. Next slide. So as I said, we do have an informational brief that we'll send out after the webinar to everybody who attended and also be up on the Colorado Safe Routes to School website. And this informational brief goes through all of the different best practices and opportunities for state, local municipality, and school district support for smart school siting, as well as the link to the model policies. So with that, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them. Go ahead and enter them in the questions box.
Thanks, Michelle. We do have two questions in the question box. One person is asking if you have the link for the Colorado statutes that reference safe routes to school, or I don't know if that's in the, I also don't know if that's in the resource that you just referenced.
I don't know if it's in the resource that the informational brief, but we can go ahead and include it in the post-webinar email.
Okay, yeah, so look out for that. I will make sure that I add that there. We also have another question about Title IX and the need for equitable sports facilities, you know, like baseball fields, softball fields, on high school sites up to a certain number of acres. And someone just wanted to know if that was true.
That is actually a question that I don't know the answer to.
Yeah, I don't either.
I do know that you know, one of the best practices for smart school siting is still providing enough outdoor space for physical activity. But at the same time, you know, that has to be balanced and not necessarily going overboard in terms of that. So, you know, there is the ability for, we see a lot of times in areas where there is constrained land, and there is a preference to put schools, to renovate schools or put new schools within neighborhoods, and they have to work on small school sites that still manage to get their space for physical activity. And part of that may be also looking at the importance of co-location and having those shared use facilities that are shared, you know, with the community as recreational opportunities.
Thanks. Any other questions? And I guess if we find out more about the Title IX question, we can also include that in the follow-up email. All right, I think those were our main questions for today.
All right.
Let's see. So a recording of our webinar today will be available on our website shortly, and we'll also make sure to link to the Colorado information and the Title IX information if we find it. If you have any other questions for us, please feel free to reach out. I'll also link to the supporting safe routes to school through school siting information that Michelle mentioned as well. So we'll look out for that in the follow-up email too. Any other last reminders, next steps? All right, thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciated your participation, and especially for those of you who've been with us through multiple webinars in this series. Thank you for joining us. It's been great getting to learn a bit more about what you all are working on in Colorado. And again, please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or things you want to talk through. And we will hopefully be in touch soon. Thanks, everybody.